Okay, the final thing that we need to discuss with our complex numbers is how to multiply them. First, you need to make sure that all radicals are simplified, and then you can perform the multiplication using the distributive property. So our first example, we have 4i times 5i. So let's just do a side example real quick. If I had 4x times 5x, you know that you would multiply the 4 and the 5 to get 20, and x times x gets us x squared. When we're looking at our 4i times 5i, we're going to be doing the same thing. 4 times 5 gets us 20. I times I gets us I squared. But when we work with our i's, we only want to see I to the first power. Remember that I is equal to the square root of -1, and I squared is equal to -1. So when we have 20i squared, that means that we need to take 20 times -1, plugging in for the I squared, and then 20 times -1 gets us to -20. Sometimes your answers will be a complex number with both real and imaginary parts. So you can have an I at the end, or it could just be a real part or even just an imaginary part. Looking at our second example, going across, we have the square root of -25 times parentheses 3 minus the square root of -16. We need to make sure that our radicals are simplified first. And if you look at our radicals, they both have a negative underneath, which means that we're going to have an I included. And the square root of 25 is 5. So I'm going to rewrite the square root of -25 as 5i. There's no more radical because the square root of 25 is 5, not a decimal. We're going to have 3 minus, bringing the negative down. And then we know we're going to need to take an I out of the root 16. And the square root of 16 is 4. So we're going to have 4i. Now that we have our radicals simplified, we have multiplication to do. And remember, even though we have i's involved, imaginary numbers, when we have a number in front of a parenthesis, that means that we're going to be multiplying. So we need to be distributing this 5i times the 3i, and the 5i times the 4i. If you want, you can go ahead and write out the intermediate steps. So we're going to have 5i times 3. We're going to have plus 5i, because the 5i was positive, times -4i. However, if you can do that step in your head, you can go ahead and skip to the next step. 5 times 3 gets us 15, and there is an I attached. 5 times -4 gets us -20, and I times I gets us I squared. These are not like terms. We cannot combine them because one has an I, the other has an I squared. But as soon as you see I with an exponent, red flag should be going off in your head because we can't have an I squared. We're going to plug in -1 for I squared. And that means that we're going to wind up with 15i plus 20. Now, technically, you can leave it like this, or if you want to be a stickler and write it in a plus bi form, you're going to write it as 20 plus 15i. Either one of these is fine. Just know that most books will rewrite it so the I comes second. 2 more to look at. We have 3 plus 2i quantity squared. Do not try to distribute the square through the parenthesis. Remember, when you have something squared, like I squared, that meant I times I. So when we have 3 plus 2i squared, that means that we're going to have 3 plus 2i times 3 plus 2i. We have a binomial times a binomial, or 2 terms times 2 terms, which means we're going to FOIL it out. We're going to take first times first. So we're going to have 3 times 3 plus, and then outer. So 3 times our 2i. And then we need to do the inner, which will be 2i times 3. And then last. So 2i times 2i. The other way to look at it is that you are going to be distributing or FOILing same way that we have been. So 3 times 3, 3 times 2i, 2i times 3, 2i times 2i. Do you have to do the arrows? No, but it is a way to make sure that you're not missing anybody. Okay, let's go ahead and simplify using the arithmetic. 3 times 3 is 9, plus 3 times 2 gets us 6i. Then we have another 2i times 3, which is another 6i. And 2i times 2i gets us a 4i squared. Notice that we have like terms in the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and combine those. We have 9 plus 12i, because 6 plus 6, plus 4i squared. And again, remember that I squared is not the same as I. Because we have an I squared, we're going to replace that I squared with a -1, which means we're actually looking at 9 plus 12i minus 4, because positive 4 times -1 gets us a -4 or minus 4. And then combining our like terms, 9 minus 4 gets us 5, and then our plus 12i. And remember, we cannot combine the 5 and the 12i because we have a real part and an imaginary part. Last one. We have 7 minus the square root of -64 times -6 plus the square root of -100. So let's go ahead and simplify. We know that we are going to have i's involved because the negative under the square root. We're going to have 7 minus the square root of 64 is 8. So the square root of -64 is 8i. And we're going to have in the second parenthesis -6 plus, we're going to be taking out an I because the -100, and the square root of 100 is 10. So again, we're going to FOIL just like in the last one. So we're going to take 7 times -6. We're going to take 7 times 10i. And then we're going to do the inside, the -8i we need to distribute. So we're going to have -8i times -6 and negative 8i times 10i. And again, if you're okay skipping that step and doing the mental math, that's fine, but make sure you show at least one of the two steps, either this line or the one coming up. 7 times -6 gets us a -42. 7 times 10i gets us 70i. When you take -8 times -6, we wind up with a positive, so I'm going to write plus 48i. And -8 times -10 gets us a -80, and then we'll have an I squared. Let's go ahead and combine our like terms there in the middle. So our -42 comes down, 70 plus 48 gets us 118i. And we're going to have minus 80 instead of I squared. We're going to put in a, you guessed it, -1. The -42 plus the 118i come down. But this time, instead of a -80, we're going to have a positive 80 because -80 times -1 gets us a positive 80, which is why I wrote plus 80. We need to combine our like terms, which are our real terms. Our -42 plus 80 gets us to 38. And then carry down our plus 118i. Make sure on these that you watch your exponents. And don't forget to plug in your I squared being a -1. And you got it.